Hi, I'm Matthias Martins. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter of How to Do Things with Stories. We've arrived at the final full chapter, and if you've been with me since chapter 6, I have a minor act of perjury to confess to you. You might recall that I said that chapter 6 was the longest chapter in the book. Well, in reality, chapter 9 is the longest chapter in the book, to the tune of 35 extra words. So, buckle up for Chapter 9, Style. For a great deal of this book, everything we've been learning applies to fiction writing just as much as any other type of storytelling. But some concerns have specific importance to writing that is meant to be read. For example, which perspective works best? First person? Third person? Third person omniscient? Which tense is better, past or present? How should narrative voice differ from the voices of characters? How do I make dialogue look natural on a page? I offer no conclusive answers to these questions. What I offer instead is a perspective on the trade-offs involved in making one choice or another, and a few personal opinions. Let's look briefly at each of the questions in turn and address how each relates to the mission of effective writing. Which perspective works best? Writing in first person puts the reader very close to the thoughts of the point of view character. The advantage of this is that the reader is more likely to feel an immediate connection to the character. When the reader reads I, he feels a little more strongly that the character's thoughts are playing out in his own head, rather than coming to him from outside. There are two immediate trade-offs, though. First, because he is closer to the mind of the point of view character, he is that much farther away from the other characters. Second, if the writer can only tell things to the reader using the thoughts of the point of view character, she can't tell him anything the character doesn't know, or even anything he would not think about. She can handle this problem by making the point of view character serve also as a narrator. That way, it's expected for the character to fill things in for the benefit of the reader. But this sacrifices some of the effectiveness that a first-person perspective has in immersing the reader in a character's experience. Which tense is better, past or present? The past tense puts events at a just slightly greater psychological distance from the reader. It's as if he is reading about events that happened far away, instead of right in front of him. The disadvantage of this, obviously, is that events have less power to seize the reader's attention and concern. Let's compare. I closed the wardrobe door, held it fast with my fingertips. The floorboards creaked under heavy footfalls. The thing outside released a thunderous huff of breath. A shock of air, warm and musky and humid, slipped through the cracks in the door and rose to my nostrils. And, once again, changing nothing but the tense, I close the wardrobe door, hold it fast with my fingertips. Outside, the floorboards creak under heavy footfalls. The thing outside releases a thunderous huff of breath. A shock of air, warm and musky and humid, slips through the cracks in the door and rises to my nostrils. What changed here? It will be apparent that the second version is more suspenseful. But why? The main reason is that the present tense implies a narrator who is experiencing events for the first time, along with the reader. What we are receiving is something we think of as the protagonist's stream of consciousness. It is immediate, unfiltered by hindsight. The second reason, closely related, is that the past tense subtly implies a narrator who has lived through these events to talk about them. The past tense voice makes us assume that we are hearing the story from a safe vantage point that the point of view character eventually reached. The writer could subvert this assumption, of course, There is no rule that says a first-person narrative voice can't come from the afterlife, or even from the moment before their death later in the story. Note that if we switch the narration to the third person, this assumption doesn't exist anymore. Angel closed the wardrobe door, held it fast with her fingertips. The person telling us this story is not Angel, so there is no longer an expectation that Angel must survive. Switching to third-person past preserves the suspense of first-person present, but it sacrifices the immediacy. We've moved from experiencing a character's mental state directly to hearing about it from someone else. This third party is speaking to us from outside the flow of experience they are telling us about. But do we get something in exchange for this? By making the narration style less direct, we create something called reflective distance. This means that offering commentary, reinterpreting what's happening, introducing context, filling in detail, feels more natural than it would in a more direct style of narration. There is room to reflect, to untangle complex in-universe events and present them to the reader in a more effective way. Let's compare with another example, starting with third person. Alma stepped onto the transport. Within seconds, she'd be outracing her own sonic boom to the Terran cultural frigate that hung in low orbit like a third moon. In her hands, she held a summons to Excelsis, an elite training program. The Terran Alliance had selected her, along with 499 other candidates, as exemplars of the Archimedean race. Of these, the program would admit only one. As the cabin became pressurized, the gills at the base of Alma's jaw slid shut by reflex. The transport's climate controls were adapted to Terran physiology, not Archimedean. The air was arid and cold and heavy. Is this a little dry? Maybe. But the point is that we've managed to fit a lot of exposition into a relatively small space. You can see why this mode is often preferred for science fiction and fantasy writing, where a lot of detail must be filled in to introduce the reader to the story's world, a world that may already be familiar to the point of view characters. Once again now, this time in first person. I step onto the transport. In seconds, I'll be accelerating upward to speeds well beyond that of sound. My destination is the Terran cultural frigate that hangs in low orbit like a third moon. I hold in my hands a summons. Hold on. You may agree that this style feels a bit off. We're getting a first-person narration, but it's jumping around to details that don't line up with a plausible train of thought for the protagonist. Why is she telling us about what she will be doing instead of what she's doing now? Why is she giving us information that isn't relevant to her immediate situation? Is she only thinking about it for the benefit of us readers? In spite of these issues, there's nothing wrong with providing exposition from a first-person present tense voice. It's just that the natural way to do it is different. Let's rewrite. As I step onto the transport, the letter of summons weighs heavier and heavier in my hand. For the 10th time today, I check the name on the envelope. For the 10th time, Alma. The Terrans believe I am in the top 500. 500 best. Or at least 500 best suited. Best suited? For what? My gills itch. I don't know if it's from nerves or from the climate controls in the cabin. Unseen tubes fume and hiss. Temperature dropping. Humidity dropping. Pressure climbing. Is this what Terrans find comfortable? Is this how it will be in the Excelsis program? My gills slide shut. The floor shakes, and I hurtle starward toward the cultural frigate that hangs in low orbit like a third moon. The sky is laced with the white smoke trails of other pods, carrying the other 499 Archimedeans to their reckoning. Whatever they see in us, I know it does not belong up there. Notice how the narration has changed. We learn about the letter of summons through its significance to Alma. We learn about the Terrans in the course of Alma's own ruminations. All the exposition is connected in some way to what she experiences in the present moment. We learn the same amount about the broader world, but we learn much more about the character's interior experience, both through what she feels and how she tells us about it. At the same time, the process of delivering the same amount of exposition takes more space. In this case, about 50% more. We also need to get a little creative to connect the exposition to Alma's thoughts, like through the feeling of the weight of the envelope, or the sight of smoke trails in the sky. This shows how narration with low reflective distance is suited to getting into the head of a character, while narration with high reflective distance is suited to laying out details in a broader context. It also shows that choosing a certain perspective does not totally commit you to a certain reflective distance. It is still possible to zoom out from the here and now, even when the perspective is first-person present. It is just a little more difficult to properly set up the links. It is also true that one can paint a highly intimate portrait of a character's interior world, even in a perspective such as third-person past. To some extent, our ability to do this depends on how much we limit the abilities of the third-person voice, and narrow it down to only what a character is experiencing in the moment. Let's try that on another piece of sample text. First, a bird's-eye view. 10,000 soldiers of the Canadian infantry swarmed over the earthwork. Neil checked his grenades one last time before vaulting out of the trench in support of his comrades. The attack had already begun, but the Krauts had an offensive plan of their own and would not easily be dissuaded from it. Once again, focusing in. Neil's fingers trembled as they splayed across the grenades on his belt. He needed to know where they were, how to reach them, but at the same time he feared that his electrified hands might by their own will pull the pins. Wet clods of dirt fell on his already grime-hidden features as his comrades' boots kicked up wet soil in their flight across the earthwork. The grenades were there, all present, all accounted for. On trembling feet, he followed after the shouts of his friends. In the first passage, we almost feel that we are hovering over the battlefield, observing it like a general or a historian. We feel very little connection to the person who is serving as the point of view. We are learning a lot of information that the character may not be aware of, and which is certainly not top of mind for him, even if he is aware of it. The second passage shows how a third-person narration can still closely connect us to a character. We focus as much as possible on what is relevant to him. We become aware of his hesitation, his preoccupation with double-checking as a nervous tic, his fear. But we sacrifice access to the eagle-eye view. It is often extremely useful to change reflective distance over the course of a story. For example, at a life and death moment for a character, we can use immediacy of prose to focus the reader's attention in the same way the character's attention is focused, and then only afterward fill in missing details about what else was going on in that moment, just as the character is reflecting on those events herself. We execute this change not necessarily by changing our grammatical perspective, but instead by either 1. Focusing on sensations and experiences to pull focus in, or 2. Focusing on memories and thoughts, especially long and wandering trains of thought, to pull focus out. It's helpful to also mirror this shift through style of prose. For example, by switching to brief, direct sentences, when reflective distance is meant to be short. How should narrative voice differ from the voices of characters? What we mean by narrative voice is a point of view that is disembodied, that is, not connected to any specific character in the story's world. Many stories are narrated only from the viewpoints of the story's various characters. When a separate narrative voice is necessary, it is because the writer needs to maximize reflective distance. A writer might want to do this in order to guide the reader through an exceptionally complicated plot, or to take breaks from the story to address the audience directly. Note that both of these things also happen to be potential warning signs of ineffective prose. The narrator's job is to tell the reader about the story as a whole. The narrative voice should be clear and neutral. It should avoid using language that takes the side of a character. If it loses its impartiality, it begins to seem like merely a disguise for the author herself, forcing a single interpretation onto the reader. We have already seen in other chapters how this makes a story less effective, and why the reader is unlikely to take kindly to the well-intentioned narrator's advice. There is an exception to the above. When a writer chooses to treat the narrator as a character, not necessarily a character who is in the story, but a character who is invested in it, or implicated in it in some way, then the reader can see the narrator's biases play out in the way the story is told, which adds a new layer of storytelling for him to interpret. Even in this case, though, the biases that color the story are the biases of that character, and should not be a mere disguise for the author. The exception to this exception is when the narrating character literally is the author, as in a few Kurt Vonnegut novels. As far as I am concerned, this is fine, though I would not expect my hypothetical displeasure to matter much to someone like Kurt. This all contrasts with the voice of a character in the narrative. As much as possible, the voice of a character should reflect the character's own mental state. If a character is anxious, it is natural for their narration to contain many unanswered or repeated questions. Where's the key? I remember having it. Where is it? If panicked, we expect short, fragmented sentences. Water rising. Can't. Breathe. If starving, we might expect the narration to occasionally trail off into reminiscing or fantasizing about food. When a character's voice lines up with the way she thinks, it is a lot easier for a reader to relate to the character and empathize with her desires. And in a certain sense, it's free. The reader is following along with the events of the plot, but he's also getting a feel for the character without even realizing it. How do I make dialogue look natural on the page? Dialogue is an enormous subject that can only receive a terse treatment here. The first piece of advice is to avoid becoming too focused on capturing what people actually sound like when they talk. Direct transcripts of real speech are boring to read and often make the speaker sound inept, even if they actually aren't. Everyday speech is full of filler, false starts, and aborted thoughts that slow down comprehension. A writer does not need to include these if they do not serve a purpose. What we really want is dialogue that distills what is going on in the character's head, while filtering out what is irrelevant to the story. It's a special case of what amounts to an unwritten rule of storytelling. The details of stories should be curated. It is impossible to exhaustively relate every possible detail about one's scenes. More than that, a writer who attempts to do so will only cause her storytelling to suffer. Instead, when her imagination presents details to her, she must exercise her prerogative as a creative and choose what goes in. A story should isolate a pattern from the morass of mere events. If I asked you to capture everything you experienced in a day, what we would find would mostly be a collection of trivial, disconnected things. But if you narrowed down this list to just the things that made you feel hopeful, or just the things that made you think of a loved one, then you would have something you could use to tell a story. Fiction is like this. It is never all of life. It is a slice of life, a slice of what is meaningful in life. In the same way, dialogue should not represent all of a character's mind. It should represent a slice of their mind, the slice that is meaningful to the story in that moment. Despite this caution, it needs to be said that over-realism is not a mistake that writers make very often. There is a much more common mistake that is harder to catch. It is when writers insert their narrator's voice into the dialogue of characters. As an example, let's take a look at the famous So Bad It's Good movie, The Room. Throughout the film, side characters go well out of their way to remind the protagonist, Johnny, what an excellent person he is. "Oh, hi, Johnny, I didn't know it was you. You're my favorite customer." Isn't this strange? In an example like this, it is easy to see what's happening. Johnny is an avatar of the screenwriter, who also happens to be the director and the actor who plays Johnny. Because the screenwriter doesn't have a strong creative vision for his side characters, he defaults to using them as mouthpieces of himself. He likes his avatar of himself, so he transfers that fondness onto all of the side characters. This is an example of especially flawed writing. But there are subtler ways for the error to creep in. Another case comes from something I saw a long time ago on late-night TV, an unknown movie about astronauts who find an alien temple on Mars. Inside this temple, they find inscriptions written in ancient Sumerian. In response, one of them asks, "But how did the Sumerian alphabet get to Earth?" To the writer, this must be a natural question, because she knows it will be revealed that the Martians seeded Sumerian civilization. But the astronaut doesn't know this yet. Is it not more natural for him to ask how the Sumerian alphabet got to Mars? At least, when choosing between the possibility that ancient humans traveled the stars and the possibility that ancient aliens created ancient humans and gave them their alphabet, it does not seem like the second explanation is the more obvious or plausible one. This is an example of the narrator writing a character's dialogue from the narrator's perspective. Writing good dialogue is similar to good narration. We want to emulate how the character thinks and show what they are thinking about. The difference is that a narrator is halfway between the reader's world and the story itself, meaning that the narrator can explain things to the reader. But a character cannot, or should not, say anything purely for the reader's benefit. Whatever the dialogue is, the character should say it for their own reasons. What's ancient Sumerian doing on Mars? There is no answer to that question that won't force us to rewrite everything we know. Who's feeling prophetic? Sir, I have been around a long time, and not once have I met a flying Sumerian. Whatever brought this here, I don't think it was any civilization of ours. Maybe they didn't bring it here. Maybe it's from here. Maybe they took it with them, brought it down from heaven to man. Brought it down from hell, more like. We'll see. This brings me to my last piece of advice. Writers should think of characters not as tools to carry out functions in the story, but as agents whose actions create the story. It may make the story harder to tell. It may even make it harder to make a story that achieves an intended effect by raising the intended questions. But if characters do not act like people, it severs the connection between the story's world and the real world. It severs the connection because the basis of that connection is empathy, a reader's ability to feel the joys and sorrows of characters as if they were his own joys and sorrows. Without that connection, a story is meaningless. I've been Matthias Martens. Thank you for joining me for Chapter 9 of How to Do Things with Stories. Stay tuned for the conclusion.